If you're looking for that faster way to really get under the skin of a topic, you are definitely in the right place. Today, we're diving deep into a story that's, well, absolutely fundamental to modern Britain. The story of the Windrush Generations. It's a narrative filled with incredible hope after the war, absolutely essential work, but also, tragically, a huge bureaucratic betrayal decades down the line.
Yeah, and it really kicks off with a specific date, doesn't it? 22nd June, 1948. That's when the HMT Empire Windrush pulls into Tilbury docks. It's carrying one of the first sort of large groups of post-war migrants from the Caribbean, mainly Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, and Tobago. And the crucial thing here, the context, is how they arrived. The sources are clear. They came as British subjects.
British subjects, not immigrants needing permission, right?
Exactly. Under the British Nationality Act of 1948, they had full citizenship rights. This was a movement within the British Commonwealth, not, like foreign migration today requiring visas and things.
And that legal foundation, that shared history, it underpins everything that happens next, good and bad. So our mission today is to trace that whole story. Why Britain needed these workers so badly, the struggles they faced settling in, the really key laws that changed everything, and then how it all led to what the sources call a foreseeable and avoidable scandal much later. Let's start right back at the beginning, after 1945. What was the situation? Why the urgent call for workers?
Well, Britain had won the war, but the country was, frankly, on its knees economically. Rebuilding needed a massive workforce. And there were just huge labor shortages across the board: construction, factories, railways, and especially in the new public services. They just couldn't find enough people locally.
Even after trying to recruit from, post-war Europe.
Even then, yeah, the demand was just too high. So logically, they turned to the Commonwealth.
Makes sense. People who were already British subjects, spoke English, had cultural ties. But it wasn't just a sort of organic drift, was it? Britain actively recruited them.
Oh, absolutely. It was targeted, very deliberate. You see clear evidence of specific recruitment drives. Take the NHS, the National Health Service. It launched the very same year, 1948. It would have seriously struggled without recruiting nurses and support staff from the Caribbean. The Ministry of Health was right behind that.
And other sectors, too.
Yeah, London Transport is another big example. They literally sent teams out to the Caribbean to hire people to run the buses and the tube. By the mid-60s, thousands of Caribbean men and women were absolutely vital. They were keeping Britain's basic services running day to day.
Okay, so they were recruited, they arrived, they're essential. Let's talk about where they settled and what life was like outside of work. We know they often ended up in cities where the jobs were places like Brixton, Notting Hill in London, Handsworth in Birmingham, Moss Side in Manchester.
That's right, clustering where the work was. But the sources show that finding work was often the easier part. Settlement was incredibly difficult. Their labor might have been needed, but the welcome was often, hostile. There was a massive post-war housing shortage anyway, nationally.
And then add racism on top of that.
Precisely. It was compounded by really widespread racial discrimination.
Yeah, the sources mention those infamous signs: no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. It's shocking to think about people running the buses, working in the hospitals, facing that kind of blatant refusal for a place to live.
It's deeply shocking. And it forced people into paying sky-high rents for often really poor, overcrowded accommodation. Exploitation was rife.
So with little official help for integration, how do they cope?
Community. That's the key theme that comes through. Amazing resilience. Churches, savings clubs known as partners, or SUSIS associations based on which island you came from. These networks were absolutely vital. They provided support, advice, a sense of belonging, filling the massive gaps left by the state.
But it wasn't all just quiet resilience, was it? There were tensions. The sources talk about flashpoints.
Definitely. Experiences varied, of course, but yeah, tensions were there. You have the disturbances in Notting Hill and Nottingham in 1958, and then the terrible racially motivated murder of Kelso Cochran in Notting Hill in 1959. These events were significant.
But those terrible incidents also spurred change, right?
Yeah.
Alongside the tension, you had the beginnings of things like the Notting Hill Carnival, a celebration of culture, and crucially, the first anti-discrimination laws, the Race Relations Act, starting in '65.
Exactly. So they were contributing economically and forcing Britain to confront its own prejudices, leading to legislative change, albeit slowly. But, arguably the biggest danger brewing wasn't the social friction. It was the slow burn policy changes that started chipping away at the very status they'd arrived with.
Right, let's get into that. Segment 3, the policy turning point. The sources really framed the laws passed in the 60s and early 70s as laying the groundwork for the later scandal. What was the first big shift?
It starts with the Commonwealth Immigrants Act 1962. That was the first major break from the idea of unrestricted entry for all Commonwealth citizens. It introduced a voucher system, basically starting to control the flow. But the really big one, the one that has huge repercussions, is the Immigration Act 1971.
Okay, 1971, what did that do?
It formally ended the right of free movement for Commonwealth citizens altogether,
Quit boss.
unless you had what the act called patriality, which was a new concept.
Patriality. Okay, break that down. What did that mean in practice?
Essentially, it meant having a direct connection to the UK through parents or grandparents born here. So if you were a Commonwealth citizen after 1971, you only kept that automatic right to live and work here, the right of abode, if you were patrial. This suddenly created a distinction. The Windrush generation, who'd arrived as subjects but mostly didn't have parents born in the UK, were now treated differently under immigration law compared to, say, someone born here or someone arriving from Canada or Australia with British parents.
Wow, so their fundamental status changed, even though they were already living here legally.
Yes, but and this is absolutely crucial for understanding the later scandal, the 1971 Act also did something else. It recognized that loads of people were already here. So it granted indefinite leave to remain, or ILR, basically permanent residency, to Commonwealth citizens who were already settled in the UK before January 1st, 1973.
Okay, so the law did protect those already here. It gave them permanent status, ILR.
It did. On paper, legally, their right to be here permanently was confirmed.
What went wrong? This seems like the core issue.
Right.
If the law gave them permanent status, why did they end up facing deportation decades later? Why wasn't there, like, a system to give them a piece of paper confirming that ILR status back in 1973?
That is the absolute heart of the administrative failure. The government assumed their status. Because they'd arrived legally as British subjects before immigration control was really a thing for them, they were just here. They weren't like later migrants who had to formally apply for leave to remain and get a stamp in their passport. So the 1971 Act gave them ILR automatically, by law, but nobody thought to proactively issue documentation to prove it. Why would they need it? They were already settled, working, paying taxes.
Because they never had to apply? They never got the paperwork?
Exactly. And that lack of a specific document confirming a status they legally possessed, that became the ticking time bomb, quietly ticking away for decades.
Until the 2010s. Okay, let's jump forward. Segment 4. The bomb goes off. The catalyst, as the sources identify it, was the UK government's hostile environment policy, really kicking in around 2012.
Yep. Suddenly, that assumed, undocumented right to be here became completely worthless in practical terms. The hostile environment policies meant people now had to prove their legal status for almost everything, for getting a job, renting a home, opening a bank account, even accessing healthcare on the NHS, the very service many had worked in.
Right. And if you were from the Windrush generation, maybe arrived as a child on your mom's passport back in the 50s or 60s, and never got that specific ILR document in 73 because nothing issued it, you had nothing to show.
You had nothing. The system effectively turned landlords, employers, bank clerks, even doctors, into border guards. They had to check status.
And it wasn't just about stopping new illegal immigration. It caught people who had lived here legally, contributed for their entire adult lives.
That's the insidious part. The idea was to make life impossible for people without documents so they'd choose to leave. But for the Windrush generation, they couldn't easily prove their status through no fault of their own. And then something else made it even worse.
The landing cards destruction in 2010.
Correct. The Home Office destroyed thousands of landing card slips recording arrivals before 1973. These cards could have been vital evidence for people trying to prove when they arrived. So the government demands proof. Then it turns out the government itself destroyed a key piece of potential evidence. It created this impossible catch-22.
An administrative nightmare. And the human consequences, when this all came to light around 2017, 2018, they were just devastating.
Absolutely horrific. People who had worked and paid taxes for 40, 50 years suddenly lost their jobs. They were denied NHS treatment, including cancer care in some cases. People were wrongly detained in immigration removal centers. And unbelievably, some were actually deported or threatened with deportation to Caribbean countries they hadn't seen since they were children.
How could this even happen? What did the official review say?
The Windrush Lessons Learned Review, led by Wendy Williams, published in 2020, was scathing. It called the scandal foreseeable and avoidable. It pointed to systemic issues in the Home Office, a culture that was too focused on enforcement, a lack of institutional memory about how this generation had arrived, and their specific legal status. Basically, a failure to connect the dots between past history and present policy. A failure of duty, really.
And the immediate reaction from the government back in 2018.
Well, there were public apologies. The Home Secretary at the time resigned. A special task force was set up pretty quickly to help people get their status documented finally. And importantly, a compensation scheme was announced.
Okay, let's move to the ongoing situation, the legacy. Segment 5. That compensation scheme designed to make amends. How's it going?
It's been problematic. The government accepted all 30 recommendations from the Wendy Williams Review, which was positive. But the compensation scheme itself has faced a lot of criticism.
Criticized for what, mainly?
Mostly for being too slow, too complicated to navigate. People found the burden of proof required was still incredibly high. And there's been criticism that the compensation amounts offered often don't truly reflect the scale of the damage done: lost jobs, lost homes, lost pensions, the immense emotional distress. So, while the intention might be there, delivering actual justice and redress is still very much a work in progress.
But there have been positive steps towards recognition, too, haven't there?
Yes, definitely. Windrush Day on June 22nd each year is now an official commemoration. It's about acknowledging the huge contribution of the Windrush Generation and their descendants. And there's the National Windrush Monument at London Waterloo Station, unveiled in 2022, a permanent, visible symbol.
So wrapping this up, what's the big takeaway here? The conclusion from our deep dive. It feels like a story of hope and incredible resilience, people making an absolutely vital contribution to rebuilding Britain. But then that contribution being tragically undermined years later by, administrative carelessness?
Yeah.
And harsh policies that just forgot the history?
I think that captures it well. Administrative neglect combined with those hardline enforcement policies. There's this undeniable core tension, isn't there? These were the very people invited here who answered Britain's call for help, helps build the country we know, and then decades later, because of failures in the system, they were basically asked to prove they even belonged here.
That failure around the 1971 Act, not issuing the proof of the status the law itself granted, that seems to be the pivot point.
It really is. And maybe the lasting question to ponder, thinking about the sources, is this. If your own laws designed to grant people permanent status, like that 1971 Act, don't come with the basic mechanism to prove that status, how can a modern state possibly balance its need for immigration control with its fundamental duty to protect the rights of people who have legally lived there for decades, sometimes their entire lives? That failure of institutional memory, that failure to follow through, it led to real human tragedy.
A crucial question indeed,
Yeah.
one that every modern state needs to grapple with. Thank you for joining us for this incredibly important deep dive. We'll see you next time.